Now this article in Vanity Fair, the January 2010 issue of Vanity Fair, also states, is talking about the crisis that hit Wall Street in 2008 when Hank Paulson went a begging to bail out his usurer buddies. The Vanity Fair article says, in the aftermath of the crisis, criticism erupted that Goldman had continued to sell mortgage-backed securities to its clients while betting against those very securities for its own account. Then the article says, clearly, in its simplest terms possible, this is true. While Goldman was never the biggest underwriter of CDOs, the firm did remain in the top 5 until the summer of 2007, when the market crashed to a halt. But of course, now we know, reading in this morning's Wall Street Journal, Goldman-Sachs was in the hook on these CDOs to a far greater degree than they let anybody know. Although we must assume that Hank Paulson, their former CEO, then as Treasury Secretary, must have known, since he was the one who started Goldman down this line of business, which his buddy Blankfein just expanded upon. So you see how here's a fellow, Paulson, who was a Wall Street man, a New York usurer, and he's supposed to be a government official. But you see how his loyalty was not to the country, which means the sheeple, the poor sheeple who had been robbed almost blind. His loyalty was to his own kind, meaning usurers. His loyalty was to these fellows here. His loyalty was not to the typical American fat slob who buys a pair of Crocs at Walmart. His loyalty was to people who look like this. Look at these distinguished gentlemen in their fancy office with those suits. The guardians of your wealth. So Paulson was looking out for them, not you. And he and Goldman were hiding the degree to which they were in the hook when they went begging for AIG. And this is just one small example, although it ended up costing hundreds of billions. This is one small example of how the New York usurers work. Let me go on and read another interesting thing in this article in Vanity Fair. Continuing on about Goldman. Goldman argues that the buyers of their CDOs were themselves sophisticated investors who were capable of making their own decisions. In other words, they were counterparties. You don't shut down your franchise just because you have a view of a market, says Cohn. When we do an IPO, people don't ask us our view of the stock market. But a less generous interpretation was given in a recent McClatchy newspaper series, which quotes an analyst report that describes Goldman as being, quote, solely interested in pushing its dirty inventory onto unsuspecting and obviously gullible investors. You see, that's how New York usurers operate. they take their dirty paper and sell it to suckers like you. And who was Hank Paulson looking out for when he claimed that the American economy could not survive if Wall Street died, if AIG died, if all the usurers, America would cease, the American economy would grind to a halt. There was no reason for any of those bailouts. It was not to save, it didn't save your job, did it? It didn't save any jobs for the sheeple. You're worse off now than in the midst of that crisis. There was nothing that happened in that crisis of 2008. None of that bailout money has done anything for the sheeple. What happened? This is a perfect example. Very succinct summary of everything that happened. Goldman solely interested in pushing its dirty inventory onto unsuspecting and obviously gullible investors. Now, I would say that perfectly describes the American sheeple. Unsuspecting and obviously gullible investors. You invested one way or another in all these bailouts. And you spent your whole, we could get into all this about the stock market and 401ks. Let's just say the New York usurers don't have your interest at heart. And these treasury secretaries, Paulson, Guyton, all these people who are running the finance economy, they don't have your interest. They're only trying to save their own class. The usury class. None of this is done for the benefit of working people in America. That ought to be obvious. There's one other thing I want to read in this Vanity Fair article. It's very interesting that this article, which tries to present itself as being an even-handed look at Goldman, perhaps being somewhat critical, but generally is favorable. But on the very day today, we get this big article in the Wall Street Journal, which takes us to a whole other level of exposing the chicanery of the usurers. But let's go back here to Vanity Fair. And it explains how Goldman now, after the crisis, after it's survived, after it's making record profits, tries to act as if it wasn't on the verge of collapse, and that they could have survived anyway without the handouts that they got from the government. And that's what we're going to pick up in the next part.